Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a modern medical mystery that you've probably heard about in the news, but maybe haven't fully dug into. We're looking at staggering new data on professional football and brain disease. The biology and the diagnostics here are incredibly complex, so we're going to break down exactly what's going on inside the brains of these athletes, pulling from a really fascinating recent report in Science magazine.
Let's just start with a massive hook from a new study published in the BMJ. The data reveals that at least 1 in 4 former NFL players developed chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or as we all know it, CTE. That is a 25% minimum baseline for a neurodegenerative condition linked directly to repeated head impacts. 1 in 4. Literally, a quarter of the players. Let's look at how this completely reshapes what we thought we knew.
Now, you might actually remember a highly publicized study back in 2017. It seemed to show that nearly all autopsied brains of deceased football players had CTE. But well, that study faced some serious criticism for selection bias. Because think about it. Families of players who suffered severe cognitive or psychiatric symptoms while they were alive were way more likely to donate their brains to science. So a lot of folks just dismissed that 99% finding as alarmist. To get to the real true baseline, researchers from Harvard and Boston University totally flipped their approach. They looked at a very specific window between 2016 and 2021. In that exact time frame, 878 former NFL players died. By using that total number as their absolute foundation, they completely bypassed the selection bias issue.
So out of those 878 former players who passed away, exactly 235 of them had their brains donated for this new study. By analyzing those 235 brains against the entire population of players who died in that window, the neuropathologists were able to firmly establish that 25% floor for CTE prevalence. And honestly, the really terrifying reality here? The researchers note that the true prevalence among these former players is likely much, much higher.
Which brings us to Section 2, inside a CTE brain, the scene of the crime.
To really grasp why this is so devastating, we've got to look at the biology. And the main culprit here is a specific protein. When a player takes a hit, an abnormal form of what's called the tau protein is released from the neurons right at the exact site of the head injury. This isn't just a bruise, It's a fundamental cellular reaction to trauma, and it's actually really similar to what we see in other severe neurodegenerative diseases.
So here's how this disease actually progresses, step by step. Step 1, the initial head injury happens. Step 2, that abnormal tau protein gets released from the neurons. Step 3 is where it starts to get really insidious. The tau begins to cluster around nearby blood vessels. And then, Step 4. Over the years, this rogue protein doesn't just stay put at the site of impact. It spreads. It literally creeps into the brain regions that control cognition and emotional processing. We're talking about a slow, physical spread of abnormal proteins that basically chokes the brain's networks over years or even decades.
And the tragic end result of this physical spread is just profound. Patients in the later stages of CTE very often suffer from dementia. It completely robs individuals of their cognitive faculties. And this right here is exactly why this disease is so feared by athletes and their families. It's not just a lingering injury. It is a progressive physical deterioration.
All right, moving to Section 3, the living diagnosis mystery, the diagnostic paradox.
This brings us to the central paradox of this whole explainer. If we know the cause, right, and we know the exact biological mechanisms spreading through the brain, why on earth can't we diagnose CTE in living people? It is arguably the most frustrating question in sports medicine right now. If a former player walks into a clinic experiencing severe emotional changes or cognitive decline, a doctor literally cannot definitively tell them, you have CTE. Let's unpack why that is.
As of right now, an autopsy is the absolute only reliable means of diagnosis. I mean, doctors can only definitively confirm CTE by physically opening the brain after a player has died, and then hunting for the disease's signature pathology. Specifically, they're looking for accumulations of lesions concentrated deep down in the grooves of the cortex. So, we're dealing with a post-mortem diagnosis for a disease that is actively ruining the lives of living people.
Now you might be asking, well, hold on, what about Alzheimer's? We can see that in living patients, right? Yes, we can, and this comparison perfectly explains the scientific hurdle. In Alzheimer's disease, the accumulation of tau protein can actually be accurately mapped out using advanced brain imaging techniques. But when doctors try to use those exact same advanced scans on football players, the imaging just fails. Why? Because the tau protein in CTE takes on a completely different molecular structure. It's kind of like trying to open a brand new lock with an old key. The scanning tools we currently have simply can't see it.
And unfortunately, that imaging problem is really just the tip of the iceberg. First off, the outward symptoms, things like major personality changes, can incredibly easily be confused with general psychiatric disorders, especially when you're dealing with older patients. To make matters even more complicated, CTE often doesn't act alone. It can actually co-occur with diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Third, current clinical blood tests just cannot distinguish CTE from Alzheimer's. And finally, when scientists have tried to create clinical criteria based purely on symptoms, the studies show they perform really poorly compared to the actual autopsy results. This is super dangerous because an inaccurate diagnosis risks false positives. That can cause immense psychological harm to former athletes who might suddenly think they have an untreatable brain disease when they actually just have a totally treatable psychiatric condition.
Let's get into Section 4, the million-dollar question, the race for a biomarker. Okay, so it's not all bad news. There is a massive, ongoing scientific race to crack this mystery, and we are finally seeing some real glimmers of hope. Just last year, researchers at Washington University in St. Louis published a small study pointing to an experimental blood test. It's catchily named EMTBR Tau 243, and this specific test has actually shown early promise in picking up the unique structure of CTE tau in patients. Now, obviously, it requires a whole lot more clinical research before your local doctor can just run it, but it proves that finding a biological footprint in the blood is scientifically possible.
So while we wait for that test to be perfected, how are we managing this? Right now, the strategies are kind of split. Over on the engineering side, there are massive ongoing efforts to make football helmets safer. On the medical side, doctors are doing their best to treat suspected CTE symptoms off-label, using some of the same drugs that are used for dementia and psychiatric disorders. But brain researchers are very, very clear on one simple fact. True prevention means not sustaining repetitive head impacts in the first place. You really can't manage a disease entirely if the root cause, the physical trauma itself, just keeps happening.
This brings us to a really incredible ongoing initiative. Dr. Gil Rabinovici, who is a neurologist at UCSF, is helping lead a massive study involving hundreds of living former professional and college players. They're using MRI, PET scans, and neurological exams to try and find a validated biomarker in living people. And for Dr. Rabinovici, finding that validated biomarker in a living patient will be a true, absolute game changer. It changes literally everything, from basic diagnosis all the way to actual treatment.
Because once we can identify CTE in a living person, we unlock what Dr. Rabinovici calls the million-dollar question. Could experimental disease-modifying drugs actually work to stop CTE? We're talking about advanced genetic therapies, things known as antisense oligonucleotides, that have recently shown some promise in fighting tau in Alzheimer's patients. But here's the catch. We can't test those drugs on football players until we can prove they actually have the disease while they're alive. Finding that biomarker is the key that unlocks the cure.
Which leaves us with this final, really profound question to consider today. The science is advancing. The data is incredibly clear that at least 1 in 4 former players has this devastating physical deterioration happening in their brain. But if the only true, foolproof prevention is avoiding repetitive head impacts in the first place, what does this mean for the future of our favorite sports? Can a game adapt to the science, or are they on a permanent collision course? It's something every single fan, player, and medical professional is going to have to grapple with as this research continues to evolve. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep reading up on this fascinating intersection of sports and neuroscience.